Today's video is going to be my first true crime video. So, a bit of a content warning. If you do not like true crime, please click away from this video. I am only doing true crime on this channel as requested, and today's case is the Cola Killer. Before we get started, thank you for being here. If you are new, hello. I'm Jessie and I post every Monday and Wednesday. And if you are returning, I am so happy you are a part of my channel. And I hope you enjoy tonight's case. I have my computer right here, so I will be reading off of that. And I found this case on Reddit, so I do not own any of the content or research in this, and I will link the original YouTube video down below. So if you would like to watch that in a non-ASMR format, it will be available. Alright, I'll go ahead and get started. So, as I mentioned before, today's case is called the Cola Killer. Let's begin. Alturas is a quiet, secluded farming community in Polk County, Florida, surrounded by cattle ranches and orange groves. A peaceful, safe district in an isolated region of southeast America, with houses spread so far that some are situated over a quarter of a mile away from their nearest neighbor. Being such a remote and tranquil location, most families would expect to live their lives here carefree, with little to no crime disturbing the neighborhood. That can't be said for one family, however, who in the late 80s would be subject to a heinous poisoning which would change the history of Alturas forever. Peggy Carr, a 41-year-old restaurant waitress and mother of 3, lived with her husband, Perelin, also known as Pie, on a quiet road in Alturas. Peggy's 3 children, Duane, Alan, and Sissy, were all from a previous marriage, as were Pie's children, Travis, Tammy, and Jelena. Both Travis and Duane lived at the home with their respective parents, whilst Tammy and Jelena resided in a converted garage apartment on the property, along with Jelena's daughter Casey. On the 23rd of October in 1988, during a shift at the restaurant she worked in, Peggy started to become increasingly unwell, feeling pains in her chest. She decided to go home, and after a few hours, her son Duane found her lying on the sofa. She was struggling to breathe and complaining of an agonizing burning sensation in her feet. Her limbs went numb, she was vomiting, and she could barely walk or speak. As the symptoms continued to manifest, Pi rushed Peggy to a hospital where doctors examined her. To their bewilderment, they could not establish what was wrong with Peggy, and even suggested that her condition could be psychosomatic, claiming that she may have been under psychological stresses which brought upon physical symptoms. Doctors kept her in the hospital under close supervision for 3 days, and in that time she began to feel better as the pain subsided. Unable to come to a conclusion on her diagnosis, Peggy was discharged and sent home, thankful that her health had returned to normal. However, 4 days later, on the 30th of October, the same symptoms returned, but this time they were much worse than before. Peggy's body once again felt like it was on fire, going completely numb to the point where she eventually went blind from not being able to open her eyelids. She was once again admitted to the hospital, where doctors were still stumped at what was causing such physical trauma. Soon after, both Travis and Duane began to feel similar symptoms of burning sensations in their feet and hands, and were also rushed in for medical treatment. With paralysis setting in and now unable to talk, Peggy would describe the overwhelming pain she was in with her sister Shirley in sign language, which they fortunately knew since their parents were both deaf. It wasn't long before other symptoms started to emerge, with huge clumps of her hair beginning to fall out. It was at this point that doctors began to understand what may have been causing the family harm and took urine samples from 3 patients. After analyzing the results, it was confirmed that they were suffering from the effects of a poisoning, in particular the chemical thallium. Thallium is a highly noxious metal, which was previously used in products such as rat poison and insecticide, but was banned in the US in 1972 due to its toxicity from accidental exposure. In its purest form, thallium is tasteless and odorless, and ingesting it can lead to vomiting, hair loss, organ and nerve system failure, and in some cases, death. For the average person, consuming as little as 1 gram of thallium can be lethal. Peggy was found to have over 20,000 times the natural normal amount of thallium in her system, with the 2 boys having a much smaller exposure. Over time, Duane and Travis made a full recovery, but Peggy unfortunately slipped into a coma within a week. It was clear to doctors and police that something, or rather someone, had poisoned the Carr residence, and Polk County Detective Ernie Mincy was assigned to find out. A thorough search was made of the Carr's house, with the garden, water supply, and cleaning products all thoroughly checked. Over 400 samples were taken from the property, with only one of these testing positive for the deadly poison. Stored away underneath the kitchen sink, an 8-pack of Coca-Cola bottles were found, all containing varying levels of thallium. 3 of the bottles were full, but 3 were empty, 2 of which were consumed by Peggy. After being unknowingly poisoned by the first bottle, she had consumed the second one after returning returning home from the hospital to keep her fluid levels up, not realizing she was making her situation worse. Worrying that there could be potentially thousands of contaminated bottles in circulation, the Coca-Cola company was contacted to investigate if the poisoning could have originated at one of their production lines. But after receiving no other reports from its consumers, it was quickly established that the contamination must have been local to the car's supply. Microscopic tool marks were found on the caps of the bottles, showing that they had been pried carefully open and then reattached after being mixed with the deadly metal. It was now evident that someone wanted to hurt the Carr household, and the police were soon on the hunt for the person responsible. Suspicion initially fell upon that of Peggy's husband, Pye, as stories of marital troubles between the two began to emerge. 6 months after marrying her in 1987, Peggy supposedly caught Pye having an affair after he began working unusually late and staying away from home for long periods of time. She left Pye and moved out, but after begging for her forgiveness, she eventually returned home, although the relationship between the two had significantly changed. During the time of her first poisoning, Pye was actually away on a hunting trip out of town, which further put him under scrutiny from investigators. However, after further testing, it was concluded that all of the family had been exposed to varying degrees of thallium, including Pye himself. The theory that he was responsible soon faded, and it was unlikely he would attempt to poison his own children, as well as himself, with such a deadly substance. Nobody seemed to know who had actually purchased the Coca-Cola, and everyone took for granted that it must have been someone else in the house that had bought them. The family all said how they also never bought Coca-Cola and they usually drank Pepsi, which gave more reason for the police to believe that this could have been an outsider who didn't know about the Carr's preferences. The Carrs admitted that they rarely locked their doors since the neighborhood was so peaceful, giving a potential suspect an opportunity to plant the drinks in the home without anyone knowing. Further investigation of the property led detectives to find an interesting note crumpled up and shoved into a drawer. Inside an envelope addressed to Pye was a post-it note with a typed message saying, quote, "You and all your so-called family have 2 weeks to move out of Florida forever, or else you all die. This is not a joke." End quote. When questioned about this note, Pye mentioned that he received it 3 months prior, but simply decided to brush it off as an idle threat from his neighbor, who the Carrs had a few altercations with in the past. The fact that Pye's unusual name was spelled correctly meant that it must have been someone he knew, and with only one other house opposite them, he was sure it was his neighbor who sent the note. Mincy decided it was time to interview the residents of Alturas, and in particular the Carr's neighbors, to try and get an understanding of who could have been behind such a terrible crime. Without informing them of the menacing note, most people who were spoken to were very sympathetic to Peggy's condition, except for one person, the neighbor opposite. The same man that Pye sending the note to his family to leave Florida, said nervously when questioned by the police, quote, "Maybe someone wanted them to move out of the neighborhood," end quote. Minzy saw this man as the prime suspect, and police began to draw up a profile and check his background. Little did they know, they were about to discover that this was no ordinary resident of Alturas, and that, in fact, the Carrs were not the only people that he had poisoned in the past. The neighbor opposite was this man, 39-year-old George Triple, a self-taught chemist and computer programmer who lived with his wife, Diana Carr. Whilst unemployed at the time, George was considered a highly intelligent individual. He was a psychology graduate with an IQ of around 150 and also a member of Mensa. I'm not sure what that stands for. He met his wife Diana through a Mensa murder mystery weekend, which they would regularly attend. Diana herself was highly intelligent, being one of the first female orthopedic surgeons in America. The pair moved to Alturas after marrying in 1981 and enjoyed living a life in peace and solitude, so much so that they didn't even own a television. Despite this seemingly innocent lifestyle, however, George's history was quite the opposite. While studying at Clemson University in South Carolina, George was notorious for experimenting with illegal drugs, but not in the way that you would expect. He would deliberately spike other people, usually without their knowledge or awareness, to see how they would behave to the effects. That's crazy. One time, George and his friend would pick up hitchhikers and give them cookies laced with drugs without their knowing, just to laugh at their reactions. On another occasion, he coated his door and fridge handles with hallucinogens, which would absorb into the skin when touched, after finding out that people were sneaking into his room. After graduating from university, George was arrested in 1975 for operating a large methamphetamine lab and spent 3 years in prison. Interestingly, a byproduct in the creation of methamphetamine is thallium, the deadly substance which would be responsible for poisoning his future neighbors. After his release, he supposedly turned his life around and wanted to make a clean, fresh start. 6 years later, however, when Peggy and her children moved into Pye's house, their peaceful existence had been shattered. With the house opposite now overcrowded with residents, George and Diana became increasingly irritated by some of the actions of the Carrs. Travis and Duane would regularly drive their loud ATVs around the neighborhood, sometimes trespassing onto George's property, and their cats would be chased constantly by Peggy's dogs. This disturbance infuriated Diana, who frequently complained to Peggy and Pye about the noise, but these were seemingly ignored. The relationship between the families hit a peak when Diana confronted Peggy in October of 1988, a week before she was first poisoned. After screaming at her to keep the noise down, Diana said, quote, "You won't get away with this. This isn't over," end quote. With all of this information, police were convinced that George Triple was responsible for the poisoned Coca-Cola, but didn't have enough evidence to prove it in a court of law. The importance means of obtaining that proof became even more crucial when, sadly, after 4 months of suffering, Peggy passed away after her life support was discontinued. George was now considered a potential murderer. Police knew that they needed to get close to George to get more evidence for a conviction, and therefore planned for an officer to go undercover in Alturas. Susan Gorick, a Polk County police detective, was assigned to the case in order to obtain evidence that George was the killer. Posing as a fellow Mensa member by the name of Sherry Gwynn, her story was that she was new to the area and currently going through a difficult divorce from her oppressive husband. Susan was able to get an invite to the 4th annual Mensa Murder Mystery Weekend, which was actually organized this time by George and Diana themselves. At these events, participants would wear costumes and take on individual personas, playing as characters in a story, acting out various murder scenarios. On the leaflet for the event, one of the scenarios read as follows, quote, "Few voodooists believe they can be killed by psychic means, but no one doubts that they can be poisoned. When a death threat appears on the doorstep, prudent people throw out all their food and watch what they eat. Hardly anyone dies from magic. Most items on the doorstep are just a neighbor's way of saying, 'I don't like you, move, or else.'" End quote. The similarities between this and Peggy's murder was strikingly obvious, with the victim also receiving a threatening note as part of the plot. Susan, posing as Sherry, approached George at the event and befriended him by complimenting his efforts to organize the weekend. She later mentioned how he was very smart, like an encyclopedia, and very easy to talk to. She forged a friendship with the couple and began spending more time with them after the event, especially with George. Susan would call the house frequently and record the conversations in the hopes that George would eventually slip up and confess to poisoning Peggy, but he never once brought it up. Susan would continue to spend time with George, going on picnics, having dinners, and eventually confiding in him of her fake, messy divorce. At one point, when opening up about her dilemma, George suggested that she should blackmail her husband, or perhaps send him some poisoned flowers so she can, quote, "get what she wanted," end quote. Susan also noticed that he had been reading the Agatha Christie novel, The Pale Horse, which coincidentally centers around the use of thallium as a method of murdering some of the characters. Despite all of these signs hinting toward George's guilt, the police needed something more concrete, and after 8 months, they finally got their chance. In November of 1989, Diana had decided that she wanted to set up a new practice in Sebring, Florida, which was roughly 40 miles away from Alturas. As such, her and George were planning to move out of town and rent out their home. Susan pounced on this opportunity and asked George if she could rent the house from them, as she was in the market for a new place anyway. The very next month, Susan moved into the property whilst the two were away in Sebring, and police scoured the house for as much evidence as they could get their hands on. A search of the garage revealed that George was in possession of many different chemicals, one of which was being a small brown bottle holding a white substance containing traces of thallium. Investigators also found that George was producing a homemade wine and owned a device that was used to seal metal caps onto bottles. One thing they did not expect to find, however, when searching through the property, was a secret passageway inside the house which led to a room full of bondage equipment and a strange-looking mannequin. It was certainly an odd discovery, but police didn't feel this was relevant in the case against George being a murderer. With the search complete, Susan wanted one last attempt to see if she could get George to confess to Peggy's murder, so later asked to meet up with them, still posing as Sherry, at a local McDonald's with a hidden camera. She informed him that 2 officers had visited her while he was away, asking about a murder in the area, and she handed him the officers' business cards. George never directly confessed to any involvement, but was startled by this and told Susan nervously, quote, "I hope I'm not a prime suspect. That could be messy," end quote. A few months later, on the 7th of April of 1990, police obtained a search warrant and visited George and Diana in Sebring. In an attempt to stop them from entering, Diana blocked the officers' entrance and had to be physically restrained to allow them inside. When searching the home, they found a multitude of suspicious items, including multiple books about poison. One of these had been written by George himself, titled Chemistry for the Complete Idiot, a Practical Guide to All Chemistry, which contained photocopied pages from a book titled Poison Detection in Human Organs. One of the pages even explored the use of thallium and was so detailed it was described by prosecutors as a, quote, general poisoning guide, end quote. Just when police thought that they had enough evidence to convict George, another bizarre twist left them with even more concern of the Florida man's true intentions. Searching through the property, investigators found another secret room, just like their home in Alturas, but this one was much more sinister. Inside this dark chamber, the windows had been sealed shut and there was no door handle on the inside. There was a solitary bed with shackles on the wall and a makeshift pulley system designed to lift a person on and off of it. Diana stated that it was merely a dark room for photography, and that the shackles were props for their murder mystery weekends. Susan, on the other hand, had been invited to their Sebring house on numerous occasions, but was never available, and she believed that the room was a prison that could have been waiting for her eventual arrival. That is so scary. The couple protested their innocence, and while she was never implicated of any of the crimes, Diana believed that evidence such as the thallium bottle was planted in her home to set George up. George was arrested and charged with 1 count of murder, 6 counts of attempted murder, 7 counts of poisoning, and 1 count of tampering with a consumer product. The trial began in 1991, with George's defense team suggesting that all the evidence that had been collected was weak and circumstantial, and nothing actually proved that George had poisoned the Coke bottles himself. In fact, George was so convinced that he would be found innocent that he arranged for a ride home for the last day of his trial. That wasn't to be, however, as on the 5th of February in 1991, George was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to death the success of the 15-month undercover operation, Susan Gorick was named 1991 Deputy Sheriff of the Year by the Florida Sheriff's Association and received a check for $1,000. Despite always defending George's innocence, Diana divorced him in 1996 and went on to remarry before dying at the age of 69 in October of 2018. Peggy's widowed husband also went on to remarry in July 2020 at the age of 76, with Duane, Travis, and the rest of the children also continuing on with their lives into adulthood. George Trapal still remains on death row to this day at the Union Correctional Facility in Florida and still maintains his innocence despite losing all of his appeals. Whilst Peggy's suffering can never be reversed, the poisonous mind responsible for her death will stay behind bars for the rest of his life, and George Trapal's toxic tendencies will remain locked away forever. Wow. I had heard a little bit about this case before, but I had never seen this much detail about it. What a horrible man. You would think that since he got in trouble for poisoning in college, he would have been put away for longer. Although I guess no one ever passed away as a result of those actions. And it is very unfortunate that Peggy lost her life due to such an evil man. Like, come on, we all have annoying neighbors in our life, but that is not an excuse to do something so terrible. What do you all think about this case? All I have to say is rest in peace to Peggy, and I hope that her children and husband find healing. And yeah, I will leave it at that. Thank you all for being here. If you would like to see more true crime on this channel, please drop cases in the comments below. Once again, none of this was my research. I was simply